So in Chain of Command World War II, we start with a fixed army size based on a couple of sections, based on one or two senior commanders, some junior officers on there. There'll be a mix of weapons, machine guns, light machine guns, anti-tank in the squad, whether you're playing the Russians, the Germans, the British, the Americans. And then based on the mission, we have support points, where you can spend these points to buy a variety of tactical options, ranging from some pretty interesting stuff like roadblocks, barricades, minefields, defensive positions. Most of the time, I'm spending them on tanks, various tanks based on the German list, if it's a Panzer III, all the way up to a Tiger or a King Tiger. On there, you can add in more machine guns. There's also an interesting aspect of the game, which I really enjoy, off-table support, which represents maybe like a barrage, mortar barrage, or artillery, or maybe a machine gun position set up on a vantage point just outside the boundaries of the table, shooting down, various smoke options on there. So you spend these points, you spend this game currency to build out your force represented by the scenario and the time. I feel when playing the Germans, especially late war, I like playing late war simply because of the toys. I mean, you've got some of the best historical tanks on there. You've got a lot of really, really interesting variants that you can play around with. But based on the situation of the time period in the German army, senior commanders are at a premium. So the army lists only come with one senior commander on there. So when you bring that senior commander on the table, if you have other tactical assets off table, they might not come on as fast. But likewise, even with the junior officers issuing orders and removing shock, the senior officer wants to issue orders and remove shock, but it's limited to that one. So tactically getting it up there, getting it into position, but at the same time, even when it's attached to a unit, when it's part of a unit on there, that's a chance to take a hit. You know, that if that unit takes some serious firepower, it's one thing to stand losing a junior officer, but to take a wound or lose a senior officer will be potentially game-changing. Not only for the force on the morale chart. Okay, I could burn a chain of command die to prevent that. I think tactically you always want to have one in the pocket ready to go for that very reason, even if you otherwise aggressively spend your command dice on there. But having two, even if I have two, I don't want to burn it for that. That's like something went wrong, or my opponent got lucky and I have to stop it on there. I'd rather save the command dice for an interrupt or an ambush, something along those lines. But the challenge here, of course, then becomes later in the game as you play and you take casualties, shock starts piling up, and now in these smaller units, even the German late war units being smaller, even going against the Americans and British that have larger units, you start taking some losses even on those units. Shock now becomes a lot more magnified for the chance for a section to get pinned or something to happen. So not having that senior officer up there to remove shock is huge, especially when you find yourself in a position, whether it's a good position or a bad position, where you really don't want to withdraw. Maybe you've got a good fire lane with some machine guns, or you just can't pull back because of the mission parameters, and you start taking shock, and now your effective rate of fire goes down. You know, you literally roll less dice to hit. So the power, not to mention on the command dice, you know, when you start out based on the army with 4 or 5 command dice to start to roll, you tend to be able to activate a lot of units that are on there. There's always going to be something in the spread. But as you start to lose command dice and you start going down and you get to 3 command dice and there's a 33% chance on each one of those dice, D6, of rolling a 5 or a 6. Now 5 will get you a command die, chain of command die. 2 6s will get you that double run, but you can't really count on that on there. That means if you don't have a senior officer on the table and you roll for a senior officer, you're kind of in trouble on there. To have that activation, if you don't have the junior officers, to have that activation of the senior officer and issue 3 orders, it is massive. So this feeds back into, there's this duality, very, very potent to have that senior officer on the table, or senior leader, I should say. but the vulnerability of it can potentially be game-changing. I find that late war, the Germans, I really have to branch off and go in one of two ways. If I have a good amount of support points, then I can take that senior officer, I can take a Tiger tank, I can take a sniper or a machine gun team. Bigger points are one thing, but if I have a limited number, 3, 4, or 5 support points on there, I find like it's almost mandatory. You want to have in your army 2 senior leaders, especially if you're going up against British and Americans that come with those stock built into the army list based on the historical time period. For late war Germans, it's possible. I've done it with just one, but you're definitely under the gun, and definitely later in the game, it becomes really, really challenging. So now that leads to an interesting decision point. Late war, take a really good tank and maybe a sniper. A little bit obsessed about the snipers, but okay, I think of Ed Harris as my sniper on the table there. Or drop down to a really light tank, an early Panzer on there. They're just pulling anything and pressing anything that they can into service there. But the challenge here is if we're in late war, the British and the Americans, if they're bringing armor, it's just going to blast through that like nothing. So I've lost that tank, and now I'm going to roll on the chart. Or even if they don't, if they go more infantry, most are equipped with anti-tank on there. And the anti-tank, although not as good as the Germans, it's still against an early, a light Panzer II, Panzer III on there. It's not much. So I find for a guy that likes to play tanks, I find myself immediately taking that senior officer and then taking a mortar team or taking a machine gun team on there. So it has to be one or two extremes from that perspective. But I would say generally, even if you branch out into other aspects like Spanish Civil War or other historical time periods using the chain of command rule set, that senior officer, that senior leader is so valuable and is so powerful to issue orders, to activate, and especially to remove shock. I would say it's an auto-include in your Army nation list.